thinking about the theme for the conference, which is synthesis. And my understanding of synthesis is that it's when we put things together, not simply in a way that these things are integrated, we put them together and build bridges so that there is a complexity, like a high level complexity. So I know that you come from an engineering background, and with your engineering, it's like, if I explain it in those terms, it's like, it's not simply putting one element with another element and creating a bigger element. This is synthesis, is more about that great complexity. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So, you know, when you make a machine, for example, and like a car, you know, when you put different elements of a car, it becomes, it's not simply wheels and tires and a steering wheel. So synthesis is like, you construct something which is of a high level of complexity. And we talked about our British education, and we talked about our Sikhi knowledge, which mostly for us, having been brought up here in England, has we've gathered that knowledge from our community, from our families, and a lot of it's been absorbed through osmosis in a way. So if we think about the importance of synthesis, is that we learn things by attaching them to what we know already. You know, like with your engineering, if there's something, if there's a concept that you understand already, and then you're learning a new concept, you attach it with what you already know, and then that knowledge gets, you know, it enhances. But when we are putting together the knowledge of our Sikhi and the knowledge of our European versions of events, sometimes it's very difficult to build those bridges because we categorize them. And I'd like to start talking about this whole thing about categorization. It's a very a Western tendency seems to be to categorize rather than the Eastern. You know, in the East we tend to make connections more. On the whole, it seems as though there's blurry kind of you know, like even Sikhi, like what is you know, I believe that the British wanted to create this kind of category of Sikhism, whereas before that we didn't really have a category as such. We were, you know, we were Sikh, but it wasn't a Sikhism, you know, that was, there wasn't that category. So what do you think about this whole thing about categorization of knowledge and how we learn to create that complex understanding of it?
So it's a great way to look at it, isn't it? It's good that you've kind of fundamentally hit it on the head, saying that there's different ways of thinking of it. So it's the same concept, it's the same image, it's the same thing that happened, but there's quite two different views of it. So the Western thought might be, well, what's that within Sikhism's rules? Whereas the Eastern philosophy is, well, it happened, so what else did it affect, or what caused it to happen? That kind of cause and effect connection. Yeah, and accepting that it happened, that's what it just happened, without trying to analyze it too much. So there is, so I think you're right, there is a fundamental difference in our way of thinking. Talking to someone, or speaking as someone who's got that osmotic input from the parents, either through, you know, just being told what to do or trying to explain what to do, and then trying to frame it with the opposite of thinking in a Western school, or being brought up in a Western school. Yeah, it can confuse us. And you know, I speak to a number of people who are also trying to get Sikhi into their head but with a Western thinking. So when they're on a stage or in a discourse, they're trying to explain things, they do start to categorize. They do start to say, these are the rules, these are regulation. Well, it's kind of fluid, isn't it? We have a secret Maryada, but it's a principle, it's a spirit of it. And we can't get too detailed into categorizing, well, this is acceptable, this isn't. There's a whole wave of what could be possibilities. So yeah, synthesizing, I suppose we're the risk that if so shall we call it the East and the Western sort of balances or the influences to the Sikh and the UK, and depending on the strength of each, so if he's brought up in a multi-generational, very paternal, maternal home, he or she will have a very closer to the original Sikhi belief system. I think we will accept that. You know, grandparents, great-grandparents may speak Punjabi, so that trickles through, and the thinking as well. Whereas someone who's brought up in a very westernized you know, maybe a third generation where parents and children don't have the influence of grandparents, don't have the influence of parents who had time abroad, or been brought up or been born and brought up here, and going to a Western school, that person will think differently. Now, you can't blame them or anything. They're synthesizing, they're creating their reality based on their lived experience and then the influence of society around them.
You see, the
So you
British even
start to
categorize
like that.
them. They even have a name for them. They're called third culture kids.
Yeah.
TCKs.
TCK,
You know,
okay, I've not heard that one before, but
yeah, TCKs they're called. Third culture generation, you know, third culture kids they're called. And there's a lot of research around them, because it's like, you know, I suppose they yeah, it is this new culture, I suppose, isn't it? They're neither of that first generation, they're neither of the, you know, the local kind of environment, but and their issues and concerns. And it's, you know, it's a process, isn't it? Like learning is a process, and this life makes us adapt. And so we are different to the way our ancestors were 500 years ago, because life has happened everywhere in the world. You know, it's like no one is the same as they were 500 years ago. And it's like, so again, like if we think of learning as a process rather than a product, if we think about knowledge as a process, the process of acquiring Sikhi, like Sikhi, the actual word, it kind of conjures up the image of a process rather than a product. Whereas if we label ourselves, we put ourselves in a box, in a category, and then once we categorize, like, well, this is the British part of me, this is the Sikh part of me, and it's like, and as though those are two separate entities, and that's when we lose some of our power, I suppose, because we're not a whole being. You know, we are different entities. We're different at work compared with our families, or you know, in different locations, and that can be very consuming of our energy to have to behave differently rather than just be ourselves.
Yeah, that's a very difficult position to be in. I think most of us go through that. I think that probably stems from not knowing who we are, and very much being influenced. And we do. If you've got, shall we say, not dysfunction, but not fully functional family home, okay, and the influences are less so. And examples could be parents are working. You know, everyone's got to work, so they're working minimum time with kids, or father's doing day shifts, mother's doing night shifts, or the opposite way around. If there isn't that, you know, the old adage, if a family that eats together, stays together, if you develop that philosophy, the family isn't having family time, you know, the influence of the elder generation on the kids will be less. So they will start to then have gaps in their learning, you might say, in their panda, the kali panda, you know, I'm an empty vessel. I'm going to be filled up with the knowledge from my parents, the experience of lived experience, and the knowledge I gained at school. And it's the third generation kids, you know, we all come into this world like this. Even our parents, you know, say, oh, we never used to be like this when we were kids. We just did as we were told, kind of, you know, philosophy. And so I think every generation on, things do change. We create our new norms depending on where we are. Okay, the last 50, 70, 80 years has taught us that geography is playing a major role in our new synthesis. So what does the Sikhi in the UK look like compared to the Sikhi in Punjab? And there will be a divergence because the influences, the experiences, the environment is different. You know, I mean, political, social, even the physical environment is very different. So, you know, we may care over here about fossil fuels and decarbonisation, whereas in India, in Punjab, perhaps they're thinking more of, no, this land of ours, we need to get more out of it. But hang on, the water table's going down. We've got a problem. So there's a totally different way of thinking, a different need being driven in the way they, I suppose, utilize Sikhi, the way they propagate, or the way they make Sikhi part of their life compared to how we make it part of our lives. So yeah, synthesis, the recreation of old norms into new norms is happening all the time, and the influences can be internal, external. I mean, you know, we're a danger in this country of being very westernized, that Sikhi does become this box that actually it's an esoteric religion, faith, that 90% of the time you're in society, you behave in one manner, and you only practice your Sikhi for that 10% or whatever, or Sunday on a Sunday every Sunday morning if you go to Gurdwara.
Yeah, and you mentioned the word vessel, and that reminds me of like this whole purpose of education and how we're educated. Because when we were educated, yourself and myself, very much the focus at that time was that the student was an empty vessel, and the teacher was there. The role of the teacher was to fill that empty vessel with knowledge, according to their capacity. And nowadays, like, we've moved away from that model, and it's like education is meant to be learner centered, it's meant to be student centered, and therefore there's more kind of more knowledge of the fact that we do need to know who is it that we are educating, and it's no longer about they are an empty vessel. But in those days, the teachers could get away with not knowing anything about us, our values, and they could say, well, education needs to be secular. We're not bringing religion into education at all, although they did. In my case, it was very Christian based, even though it wasn't a Christian faith school as such, but it was nevertheless Christian based. But everything, even though it's not openly declared, there is our values, maybe not in engineering, maybe not in the sciences, but when we're talking about social sciences, our values are imbued in what we teach, in what we choose to teach, and what we choose to, select. Who do we choose to put up? We talked about Gandhi and Bhagat Singh. Who is it that decides that we're going to elevate Gandhi and say he's a role model, and Bhagat Singh, well, we're not going to talk about him because no one knows about him. So why is it that one is known and one is not known? Who chooses that? How those are all the social values that we demonstrate in what we teach, right?
Create, as I say, history is written by the winner, isn't it, or whatever the right phrase is. Who wins a battle writes how it went, and very much so our history that we learn, how we have been learning. I mean, we went to similar kind of background in schools, and I remember learning the history of the UK, as in the kings and queens of the last 300 years or something like that, or the Dark Ages, or the Bronze Ages and stuff like that. And I thought that's very relevant for the time. But yeah, so there was a time when the history curriculum was just taught to you as facts, and that's it. And I struggled myself to learn how to think beyond that. Well, the fact is a fact. Well, no, hang on. London wasn't always just London. The capital of England wasn't always London. It was, I think, Winchester. So we didn't get taught that. So the historical and context, because this is all based on how we've evolved, or how Sikhi, how other religions, how faith, how education's evolved. There is so much knowledge out there. It's just the tip of the iceberg which is taught, and then it's taught. You can skew that very, very any way you like. So your story there of Gandhi against Bhagat Singh, well, whichever one had the greater followers will end up in the textbooks, and that's
it's just that at the time, when Bhagat Singh was executed, a couple of years before his execution, he was just as popular as Gandhi was. So it's not that he didn't have a following. He did have a following. He still has statues. We have statues of Bhagat Singh in the Punjab. So but the thing is that our teachers, they don't know about Bhagat Singh, and they don't think it's important for them to know.
I think part of it is the last 70, 80, 100 years. I say broadly that region. There's been 2 world wars in the last 100 years, and a lot of people have died in that. And I think coming out of that, particularly with this week's curtain of the Ukraine-Russian conflict, people don't want war, but war has happened. So we've actually had a period of, is it the longest peacetime period in history, I think, in Europe. And people are peaceful people generally, and therefore the history that they want to push. And remember that a lot of the schooling curriculum, etc., post-war, post-Second World War in India, was still British influence. So now you have in front of you, so the British government, British India Tea Company, or etc., leaving India or being ousted from India, whichever way you look at it. It's the same thing happened, but it depends on the lens. Question is, who do you want to be the hero? Do you want to be the pacifist, the Gandhi, or do you want to be the Bhagat Singh, which actually, if people acknowledge him as the hero of the ousting, then becomes a different conversation. It's about Ankh, I think they call it. My mentor called it Ankh. You should have Ankh, you should have spirit, inner spirit. So that miri piri concept, well, which one do you want to push? Actually, six, we are both. We have to be spiritual and soldiers at the same time. But if the narrative is only pushed for the spiritual side, the Gandhiism side of, oh yeah, peaceful demonstrations and pray hard and it'll all go away. Well, actually, you do need the sword as well, the metaphorical sword.
You see that by the time that we got independence in 1947, the majority of the people who started the Gandhian movement, they had died of old age. It took 50 years.
Well, both of the media periods started together, didn't they, in the 1870s, 1860s, 70s. The Babur Khalsa movement, the Singh Sabha movement, all those, what you might call the Murtas. There was some, people took up arms to fight the fight. But you're right. At the end, those who were fighting the fight were killed off. They were martyred. Yeah, Bhagat Singh martyred, etc. They were all put to one side, and those became the heroes of the time. But the people who took charge was ones who managed to get through it. So, like it or not, they're the ones who prospered in the end. So we're here now. We'll now set up the laws and so forth. It's a tough one. There's no right or wrong, but we have to, when we tell history and we talk about infusing a spirit of, the future generation with a spirit. What should that spirit consist of? It has to have both. It has to have that miri piri concept. It has to have call it the Gandhian concept, not Gandhi, but the Gandhian concept of peaceful demonstration, but also the Bhagat Singh concept and others of taking up arms. And you need both. And it's not taking up arms to attack, it's taking up arms to defend and make sure that the message is out there. In today's day and age, those arms are now, it's about education. So the physical arms are now education, and the pen is mightier than the sword. So it's about being educated and having the will to, the capacity and the ability to write. Very much like yourself, you're educating yourself to elevate others and elevating the thinking to a higher level. And so it is that our fighting arm is really the hand that writes, not the hand that wields the sword. Does that make sense? That's a concept I have in my mind, that in today's day and age, even the farmers' protest for the last year, which ended recently, wasn't a physical protest as in arms and so forth. It was a peaceful protest, but it was a spirit of fighting. Yeah, we are prepared. We are here to martyr ourselves. We are prepared here to die, but we're not take up arms. But we have to. We are ready. And in the end, that was solved by them negotiating the end. Okay. So that's still going on, I know, but in a very high level way. The end is always negotiated on paper. It's always negotiated by coming to a truce. And yeah, that deterrent of the sword should remain a deterrent.
And we talk about education being important, and then it's like, well, what kind of education? Because we've got education that's based on a very kind of the scientific method, based on the Newtonian kind of logical, everything is like a machine, and we can harvest 4 crops as opposed to only 1 crop in a year, and there's no kind of regard of how that's going to deplete the soil and cause pollution, etc. And so we need to think about, well, what kind of education is it? Is it like Guru Harai, he was teaching environmentalism, whereas the scientific method, it's led to these industrial revolutions of mass production and mass kind of like devastation without an ecological kind of sustainability. So we do have to, like you have an engineering background, I come from an arts background, psychology, etc., social sciences, and it's a very different kind of thinking. Like for me, it's about subjectivity. You know, it's like
Mm.
there is no absolute truth, whereas in engineering or in medicine, you know, maybe in some of the sciences, the natural sciences, we can think about a very different paradigm, and we can elevate the Western, the European education in that sense, because they are more advanced. You know, the industrial revolutions began here, they didn't begin in the Punjab. But in social sciences, you see, the British thought that we were inferior in all sorts of ways, including in education, because they thought that a lot of our knowledge was based on mythology, unproven, intuitive superstition. And so that's why, you know, our education was kind of like discarded. It's like, well, that's just a lot of hocus pocus, and this is real knowledge. Real knowledge is like scientific. It's not superstitious. It's tried and tested. And a lot of what we know about Sikhi and our intuitive kind of beliefs, we can't prove it in tangible terms, in a not in a scientific way. And so we, you know, I think we also colonize our own minds by elevating just this particular version of education, as opposed to, as you say, like, we're not kind of broadening our embrace and thinking, well, yeah, that is good, but where is all this ecological environmentalism that we need for sustainability?
Yes, it's a tricky one, isn't it? I think it's one of these circles that keeps going round and round. So if we wind the clock back 400 or 500 years pre-industrialization, most communities in the world lived with the seasons, who lived with the earth, with the environment, and were subject to it. Along came this industrial revolution, along came machines that allowed you now to do things that, well, couldn't be done before, or could be done faster or quicker. So that now the question is, was that driven by, well, we've got this invention, let's use it for mankind's improvement, or actually let's use it to exploit mankind? Yeah, there's an argument either way. So whilst it has improved, so now wind the clock forward 400 or 500 years, what has science done? It has improved our living standards, I think. You know, far more people are we're loosely educated. You know, there's mobile phones in pretty much, thank you, a cup of tea there, my daughter. Oh, bless her. People, you know, there's a mobile phone in pretty much every third person on the planet. You know, there's a few billion mobile phones around. Now, that wouldn't be possible without science. Yeah. I'm from a civil engineering background, and strange as it might sound to you, so civil engineering just sounds black and white. You know, you do your 1 + 1's got to be 2. It can no way be more than 2 or less than 2. 1 + 1 is 2, and that's right. However, civil engineering, which is sort of thought of as the mother of all engineering professions, is actually defined in its charter in the UK, the Institution of Civil Engineers, as the art of. It's not a science. It's defined as the art of, and it goes on to say it's about harnessing the natural resources in nature for betterment to mankind. But it's defined as an art, and it is quite frankly, I think, you know, in my learnings in my teenage and, you know, university days, well, yeah, this is black and white. You make a bridge stand up, you've got to do this. But I look at it many years later, 2 decades later, I look back and I thought, actually, everything we were doing, black and white was great, the numbers were great, but actually there's an art to this. There's a science, but it's underpinned by art. There's an artistic flair required to make this happen. And I think so it has been in that 400 or 500 year period we're looking at from Guru Nanak's time, where, you know, he was a contemporary of many of the revolutions and not the industrial revolution, pre the industrial revolution, but things were happening in the world at that time of exploration and so forth. That science was on the up because people now were willing to go that extra mile to find out what was beyond the horizon, or whether there's prosperity. So we could talk about the Indian tea company exploiting India for its resources, creating a disbalance where now you've got international trade, along with the Portuguese, the French, the Spanish, they're all Italians, they're all at it. So they're creating this imbalance between supply and demand and creating products which now they can exploit or provide to others, raw materials into processed goods. that prosperity allowed arts to flourish, allowed science to be actually pushed. And I would say that circle of prosperity leading to, you know, achievements probably happened in India or China or wherever a few thousand years before. So they'd been through the cycle, they'd actually got through the cycle of prosperity and realized actually it isn't having everything isn't everything. Maybe the life is actually about that balance between the scientific principle, the Newtonian issues, and life in general, that holistic view of life, that actually life is more about who you enjoy time with and what you do rather than what you achieve, because you may never achieve what you set out to achieve. So that balance, I think we'd been living it. I think I'm not 400, 500, 300 years old. You know, our guru's been teaching us about living in harmony with the environment, living in harmony with communities, and living in multicultural communities, multi-faith communities. Harai Sahib saying, you know, look after the environment, and you know, and demonstrating that in his ways. But in the West, science was being pushed and pushed and pushed for further investment, further advancement. I mean, you know, without science, we would not have been to the moon. Now, whether you believe people went to the moon or not is another matter, but we have got people in space, we've got people on the moon. We achieved that through scientific advancement.
Mm-hmm.
That could not have been achieved with just pure faith, but it did require faith to know that we could achieve those scientific breakthroughs. So I think that, you know, I think the world is now coming to a point where actually even doctors realize that we can't do everything. Sometimes we just have to have a belief that we will work out. I don't know if that answers the question or opens up the debate.
No, I think that you're absolutely right. Of course, you know, these industrial revolutions, of course, they have created material prosperity. And at the same time, we need to embrace the whole, synthesize the arts with the science. You talk about your civil engineering. Well, in the 1600s, before the East India Tea Company came to India, under Mughal rule, that area of the world was the most prosperous. I think they were, you know, they had about 25% of the world GDPR share at that point. It was one of the richest countries in the world. And I've been to the fort in Lahore, Maharaja Ranjit Singh's fort, and it was air conditioned through civil engineering. You know, there was no kind of like modern air conditioning, but just the way it was designed in a way that there was cool breezes from the river, you know, and it was just designed in a way. It was the architecture that created the air conditioning, as it were. And
you've got examples of that going through. I mean, just taking science and engineering as an example, going back to Roman times, you know, in Roman times you hear of Roman villas in, okay, Italy's warm, but northern part of Italy, and the Roman Empire went north of, predominantly north of Italy, which is a colder climate. And homes and cities there were heated with communal heating systems. So heat was transported like very much underground, or you know, and warmed houses up, and houses were built in certain orientations and certain layouts. Window sizes were certain sizes to let the heat in during the summer, and in the winter the heat, you know, coal fires, etc., fires could heat the house up and provide warmth. And sewage systems were, you know, I mean, India is just getting around to now to putting sewage systems in after developments like, you know, 3 stories up. I know the more modern planned bastian and settlements and so forth have got the infrastructure in before they're built, but you know, the Romans were doing this 2,000 years ago. So science has evolved, but and you know, quite often it's I'm in the construction industry. We quite see it all the time. When greed drives advancement, that advancement has a shelf life. When it's driven by a need to serve, it actually has a longer shelf life, yeah, and may actually be there for forever, kind of thing. So greed has an end in itself. It creates its own end.
That's right. You see, that was the downfall of the East India Tea Company. You know, the downfall is that there was a lack of ethics. They didn't. It was exploitation en masse. It was, but there was nothing. You know, it wasn't sustainable because they were barbaric in the way they treated the local people. You know, they weren't investing the, you know, what they extracted from the country. They weren't reinvesting it there locally. They were taking it away to Britain. And so it was like, that was not sustainable. Exploitation is not sustainable. Being ruthless with people, massacres and all of that, that's not sustainable. And so a company needs to have ethics in order for it to be sustainable.
Yeah, it's stating the obvious, isn't it? And I think for some of us who've got perhaps a generation to generational experience, influence from our parents, grandparents, that's an easy thing to think. Whereas, like you said, the third generation or third culture kids thinking very much in a materialistic Western way don't get that. Well, yeah, I work for this company, our job is to make money. What are you going to do with the money? You know, what's Facebook going to do with its billions and billions and trillions? What's it going to do?
Yeah.
And, you know, that's the East India Tea Company did that with India. It raped, pillaged, looted, call it what you like, the resources of India. Did it actually benefit India? I don't know. You know, the Mughals in India benefited India. There was prosperity, you know, the Taj Mahal was built. So there was, you know, reinvestment in, okay, people, you know, they were taking stuff back over across the mountains, but there was prosperity in the region, and that's why everybody fled to it. You know, they call it the Golden Nightingale. So the locals prospered despite that sort of, you know, external influence. Now, I don't know enough about the history of the East India Tea Company in India, except all I know that it was an invasion. Basically, it was a case of just let's capture this country and make it ours, and they did. You know, the British ruled India for 100 years, give or take. So they did rule it, but was that a rule, or was it exploitation? Was it, you know, for their own benefit, or was it for the benefit of India itself? I mean, I heard, I'm not too familiar with the stories, but, you know, a lot of the stuff was exported out. Was there a crisis in a food famine in Bengal, and the rice was taken away from the people there, and they were left starved when it could easily have been a humanitarian, you know, quick fix. So yeah, you know, I think the British have got a lot to answer for positively, but a lot negatively as well. Rules, like you said, barbarism. I mean, the classic one is, you know, we've all seen the various films. I think Lagan is the one that sticks in my mind the most, of how the British or the East India Tea Company, etc., they treated the locals. You know, Indians were the equivalent of dogs. You know. So that's not humane. And when companies lose that sight of the human capital, even companies in this country now or anywhere, in fact, when they lose sight of the human capital, and then human capital suffers, well, those humans will leave. The company will then, you know, not prosper anymore. So it's a huge mistake to make. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, there was kind of an awakening in this country of, oh, CSR, corporate social responsibility, and we need to be a bit more aware of our environment, our responsibility to society and so forth. Well, where were you for the last 50 years before that?
That's right. And a lot of the corporate social responsibility ends up being PR, you know.
Tick box exercise.
Yeah, that's right. You know, so the thing is, you see, Maharaja Ranjit Singh died in 1839, and as you know, like the Sikh Empire just basically disintegrated on his death. That's because they were fighting each other. You know, there was no kind of strength. There was total disunity. But then in 1857, when there was the uprising against the East India Tea Company because of their barbarity, the Sikhs actually became allies of the British. You know, this was like a shock to me. I didn't know that they were supporting the British to, you know, that like we ourselves have a lot to blame. You know, we have ourselves to blame for being colonized, because we thought our ancestors thought that they could be partners with the British somehow. But then I think it was when things like Jallianwala Bagh, those massacres happened, that's when we probably were shocked into awakening and thinking, no, you know, we thought we were their equals. We fought in the First World War thinking we were equals fighting in the army together, but we were not.
Yeah.
So
no, that does break my heart. I mean, I don't know enough of the history of the mutiny. I know what it's caused by, but you know, in love and war, there's no written rules really. I mean, the preceding 100 years before Maharaja Ranjit Singh were the Missals. They were fighting each other all the time. But when it came to the important issues, they came together and, you know, had the two, you know, the Gurmat they passed in Amritsar twice a year, and they went out and did what they needed to do, and then came back to report. Maharaja Ranjit Singh, yes, he consolidated the Punjab, consolidated a Sikh Raj, a secular Raj, with all religions held in equal favor. But the ethics of Sikhi, I think that was the basis of his Raj. There's two things here. Whenever you hear of great heroes, they never leave a legacy. There's never something after them. They are so grand and so large that then there's a downfall immediately upon their demise.
Well,
British have conquered that. They say, no, the system and the process is more important than the individual. Prime ministers come and go. Yeah.
mm-hmm.
Ministers come and go, but the government functions. You know, this country's had a stable government or governments of a couple of 300 years now. Or despite their internal differences, etc., you know, that government of the UK prospers. Maharaja Ranjit Singh had built up his court, had built up his empire, or the empire, and it was lost because people after him couldn't handle it. Now, whether they were incapable or the infighting that he hadn't been able to stem, maybe it was an unholy alliance that they put together. You know, there's so many different reasons, but it didn't help by the British being quite astute about this and realizing that the Sikhs were the last of the ones to fall, and by their clever shenanigans, and I think it's what I would say is the economic sword. Yeah, well, Punjab, you know, you can sell to us. We can't. Well, actually, you can't sell to anyone else now. Your crops, so we'll pay you half what we should really pay, because you're a captured market now, that monopoly. And I think there was exploitation. The exploitation led to economic destitution. That then, well, you know, Punjab is landlocked. It can't go onto the rivers. It can't, sorry, into the sea, and, you know, trade itself. So the peoples could possibly have been through economic destitution, forced to take up the jobs that were available. Well, the British needed a fighting force. The Sikhs are good at fighting, so instead of putting one family member to become a Sikh, which meant being the Khalsa, that became the paradigm for you joining the army. Hence, a large number of Sikhs were recruited into the army, and their bravery shows and so forth. You know, 2% of the population, was it 30% of the army or something? You know, I don't know the statistics, but they were very disproportionate. The question then arises: it's post 1857. Well, if your son's in the army, you don't really have much of a choice, do you? You know, it's stay in the army and serve, or where you're going to go. And it was a tough time. I'm sure the people of that time had very tough decisions, very much like now. You know, I think it's the Korean War, where in America there was, you know, people were not wanting to go and fight in Korea because the principles seemed wrong, but the reason they were fighting was wrong. So people were, you know, court-martial, or not, well, it can only be if you leave the army, but, you know, whatever their punishments were for not joining the army. So I think 1857, that period was a very difficult one, and it very quickly gave rise to, hang on, we think they're our friends, but actually they're not. So the seeds of Jallianwala Bagh, the seeds of Nankana Sahib, they were all sown in that 1880s, 1870s, when people had
Jallianwala Bagh happened in 1919, so that was several generations
40 years later, but
yeah.
two generations later. But the seeds of discontentment were with the, you know, the Namtari, the Singh Sabha movements of the 1870s, 1880s, around that time, 1890s. You know, all the stories of you know, Sikhs and going over to Canada, then bringing, you know, trying to come back and influence politics and so forth in the Punjab and being caught. All those activism, you know, straight away after 1857. So although we were conscripted into the army or voluntarily into the army, we were there and we were serving. Did we really fool ourselves? Well, look, Sikhs aren't one body, you know. You know, you're a lecturer,
we're motivated by self-interest, I suppose.
Yeah,
you know,
we're human beings as well. Roti, you know, roti kapda maur makan. We have to look after ourselves. We have to feed our kids. We have to put shelter on and a roof over their heads. So people are doing what they need to do. As long as that's done with the spirit of Sikhi, you can do whatever you do, wherever. Okay. So I don't think it was a bad thing to serve with the British Army, because it was a necessity at the time. Hindsight's always a lovely thing. We shouldn't have done it. Well, what about those people would have
Well, we did
rather
it
starved than
again.
died.
The thing is, you see, we did it again. So in 1919, there was Jallianwala Bagh, and we knew, the soldiers knew how badly they were treated in the First World War. They were treated very badly when they were fighting. Like the British people would get awards and medals and whatever, but
they'd be forgotten.
They'd be forgotten, and so they knew that. But they still, even more, went to fight in the Second World War. So it's not as though we learnt anything from our from those episodes. Those were two very, because a lot of the soldiers came back with that Spanish flu, and villages were wiped out, and there was no kind of like, they weren't,
there's no care afterwards. I suppose it's no different to the last 50-60 years post independence. Oh, I want to get my son out of here, I want to get my daughter out of here, go to Canada, go to America, go to UK, go to Australia. So you're absolutely bang on, but it's self-interest, and greed, maybe. I don't know, it's a controversial thing that say Sikhs aren't greedy, but we're as human as any other human. I think decent beings will be decent regardless. Just because I wear the star and might wear a kirpan and stuff like that doesn't make me any better Sikh than anyone else. But those who achieve the highest accolades in Sikhi are true, but everyone else like us are mere mortals trying to do our best. So was it wrong for the soldiers at the time to stay in the army? Who knows? More can dissect that umpteen times. Is it right for people to be leaving the Punjab, emigrating to Canada, to America, to UK, to Australia? It seems to the sort of popular places. If we look back that, we say, well, actually, they should all be staying in the Punjab, making Punjab prosperous, or going abroad, getting an education in the sciences, and coming back, making Punjab prosperous. But why aren't they doing that? So it's a very difficult argument, and people will look back at the migration period. I mean, obviously, in two years of COVID has probably put a stop to that at the moment, but it will start up again. And if welcoming countries abroad want the Sikhs, they will go abroad. If they don't, then they will have to find prosperity in the Punjab, in India, in some ways. So I don't know. It's a tough one. I'm not clever enough to know all the ins and outs of it, but quite often economic necessity drives people's decisions.
Yeah, and I suppose that the only thing we can do is like have these conversations, and all we're doing is just having a conversation and bringing up these nuanced kind of complexities in what we believe and how we behave, and this whole concept of like what is the purpose of education? Because I know that for me, education was, I wanted to travel, and I knew that my route to travel was through education. I taught abroad, etc. So my teaching was like a passport to travel, I suppose. And most of the young teenagers that I teach, they want to get a good job, obviously. They want to be able to buy a house, they want to be able to buy a car, and then we think, and then what? Well, after you've got your house, well, then we'll buy a bigger house.
A bigger house, yes.
Yes, you see.
They call it my father used to call it the gate, with this counting to 99. Counting to 99, you always want that extra one to get to 100. And you say you'll never get there, because after 100 there's 101, there's 102, you'll never get there. And that desire to aspire is good, desire to accumulate is not. Material goods it's not good for you. They'll come and go in your life. You'll have a big house one day, small house the next day, a few years later, another even bigger house. These things come and go, but life doesn't. Life is a one-way ticket. There's only an exit from it. And I think one of those wise, back to the India, back to our roots kind of thinking, something my father espoused, and is, he goes, make your life first. With a partner. That is life. It's that shared journey, and all the other sort of, you might even said, he was quite blunt about it, he said love, material wealth, houses, cars, they'll all come as your needs are. You'll have enough that you feel time that you need them. There'll be enough. You'll always want more, but there'll be enough. And that's quite wise words. Even now I tell everyone, look, a lot of kids are now coming through this education system saying, 21, 22, I've got an education, I need to get a job, I need to get a house, I need to get a car, then I get a wife or a husband or a spouse, etc. And actually it's the wrong way around, because those cars will get bigger and bigger.
Mhm.
So you become 25, you want a Ford, 30, you want a Lexus, 35, you want a Range Rover, 40, you want a Ferrari, or whatever. That desire will increase, and then life will just pass you by, and you'll look back and think, oh God, have I let that happen? And it's a tough call, because the societal norms under which I presume you and I and myself got married, that kind of semi-arranged marriages time, even that is very hard now. So youngsters having to find spouses in an environment where it isn't, we're a small percentage of the population, so most of your time is spent in the you might say the non-normal population, where you might want to find a partner, is harder and harder and harder. Society is changing. We're creating a new synthesis, you might say. Sikhi, Punjabi culture is being diluted down. It'll reform in its new way, fit for the next 20 years, but it'll be different to the last 20 years.
That's right, because it's that process of adaptation, the process of, I mean, that is natural, because we're not the same as we were 500 years ago in any sense. But again, it's this, the purpose of education. Is the purpose of education to gain a qualification, or is the purpose of education to gain confidence and communication skills and all these intangibles? And for a lot of my students, it's to get a qualification. They're not interested in thinking, or the whole kind of the learning process. They would love to surpass that learning process and just have an easy way, a shortcut to get that qualification. And so the focus seems to be very much on the material things, the products, rather than the actual process. And I think that's where we seem to have lost our way, because it's through the process that we experience our oneness with everything around us, but not if we're so focused on getting a house, paying that mortgage. And we enslave ourselves for decades, like 20-year mortgage, 25-year mortgage, and then we get a bigger mortgage
now. Lifetime mortgages now.
Yes.
No, it's absolutely true. I mean, that is the system we're in. There was a time when I speak to older people, and they talk about, oh, so and so went to university, or went to the Balad, went abroad, studied and came back, and he's clever. They didn't measure cleverness as in, the ability that 1 + 1 is 2. It got educated, but there was a wisdom of that pastoral care that you get at university, which I don't think is there now. And you came out as a rounded person, the ability to think. So your question earlier about, is the acquiring knowledge, or is it the ability to think with that knowledge as an underpinning kind of knowledge base? And it's that latter. We've lost the ability to think. I was stuck on the treadmill. Needed a qualification, got the qualification, got chartered, had a job. The job was a career. And you had to go up in your career. If you're stuck in your career, you're looked down upon. But it took me 30 years to realize, actually, that wasn't the purpose of the education I had. The purpose of the education was to try and do something better. Just to think outside the box. So that get a job, get all your material goods is part of the process, but it should it should not be the main purpose of the process. The process is about making society better.
Yes, that's right. And the other day you asked me, like, when did the penny drop? Like, when did you realize that, maybe, when did my paradigm shift, I suppose? And I said to you that it was when I got the PhD, because before I had the PhD, I always thought that there were other people who knew more than I did in education. So like the curriculum, sometimes I could see flaws in the curriculum, but I didn't know enough to see exactly why these were flaws. I suppose I didn't have the vocabulary to say, like, where there was unfairness or bias in the assessments and whatever. And it was only through, like, you have to reach the top of the mountain to be able to look down and see that, the journey that you've traveled. And that can take a lifetime. It does take a lifetime. When we're still striving, we don't have the time and the space, and we don't have the experience to be able to see, what we've what we can
already
see from the
achieved.
top. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's called imposter syndrome, isn't it? That I haven't got quite to the top, so I'm not good enough. But actually, you're halfway up. If you just turn around, look back, you've come a long way, and we've got to share that with others. And it's the old, you've seen the memes, the images of leaders may not be at the top, but they were putting a hand back and pulling others up with them. And that's what we aren't taught to do. That we're taught about get to the top, get to the top. Yeah, not take others with you on that journey, because you may never, like you said, you may never reach the top. Life might get cut short before then, or other things may happen which stop you getting to the top. But you've got the top of where you can get to, and to appreciate that place, that moment in time, and to do reach back and help others. And as they say, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Well, we've got the education because others have put in the research, and so it's a paradigm shift. I think we called it a pound drop moment, when you realize, oh my God, my duty is not just to take in what I know, what I've learned, and strive more. You have to take others on the journey, and some of those students may pass you by and going further than you, which is great, because then you look back and think, I like that one. He's done really well, or she's done really well.
Yeah, for me, it was like, I still see that metaphor of myself of being at the top of that plateau. And when I arrived at that top of the plateau, I could see all the different pathways that I could have taken. So I could see like the pathway that I took, but then you see, well, look, maybe my experience would have been very different if I'd taken that pathway. And so this is where the gaps in my knowledge, the gaps in my knowledge about Sikhi, for example, they become apparent being at the top and thinking, well, what has been the opportunity cost of focusing on this kind of education? What have I missed from this other kind of education, which was, seen to be not as valid? It's like, again, it's only through having that qualification of the PhD, now I can do my research in a way that I want to do research, being intuitive and being, like being able to focus on stories rather than that logical, analytical approach of like the empirical approach of like, well, something has to be, you have to do surveys or questionnaires, or, it's like,
well, it's the same principle. You still have to go and acquire different opinions and viewpoints and so forth. But you're right, it took a PhD for that paradigm shift. And PhDs aren't about learning a subject being brilliant at it. It's actually learning how to think and analyze to a really deep degree, rather than, I think, BAs, bachelors, masters, or more or taught degrees. PhDs where you have to really think hard, because it's just open book, isn't it? So it's at least the penny dropped, or the pound dropped for you. Well, many of us go through life not realizing those things that we've missed, or potentially.
The thing is, once I got the PhD, I thought, why were we not taught this way to start off with? You see, that's what I thought. I thought, the purpose of all education should be to learn and to create value and to challenge and to think in a different way. So why did it take a PhD to think in that way? That's the way, and this is what I'm trying to encourage now, is like debate and conversations and discussions, and that through these questions, if learning takes place, this is adding value. We're co-creating knowledge. We don't have to.
I mean, Gurbani says, the translation of, if you read and read and read, what have you achieved? You've just laden your cart with knowledge. Whereas, now don't quote me because I'm not very good with the Gurbani, but there are shabs in there. Sorry, I'm shifting on my chair. About education through discourse. Discourse, vichar, patandra, right? We're doing that. Discourse is the doorway to real education. To open up your mind, different ways of thinking, different perspectives. And am I sat at Amritsar, or am I not? You're seeing me sitting at Amritsar. I know I'm not. So what's the truth? There is no truth. Until you debate, you're not going to know the truth. And you may never know the truth, but you have a path that gets you a step further than where you were yesterday. And that can only be achieved by discourse. If we take Sikhi now, in a pure Sikhi sense, if you're going to learn about Sikhi, you're going to learn about Gurbani, you're not just going to get it from reading the text, reading books and so on. You've got to go practice it. You've got to sit down with people, Sangat, doesn't mean Sangat in the Gurdwara. I mean Sangat is a collection of people that actually discourse something, discuss it, and everyone's knowledge, goes up a peg. And we don't do that. You're absolutely right. We don't do that. We don't have those forums anymore, or where they are, they're very small or very kind of not even niche. I'd say they're very, limited in who can do that and who pulls them together. We're just too busy with everything else. We don't do it.
Yes, well, this is again one of the advantages of now that we're in the fourth industrial revolution. We have cyberspace to create, we can take advantage of all these opportunities, like yourself and myself. If without cyberspace, we would not be having this conversation because we live too far away. And for a 1 hour conversation, who's willing to travel all the way, like for a 1 hour conversation? And it's not sustainable. We both have to go to do our other work, and but cyberspace has made this possible. And Habermas, the German philosopher, he talks about the life world and the spheres of communication, and that's one of the things that we have lost, is that when we go to the Gurdwara, the Granthi will do the sermon, but there's no opportunity to engage in a discourse. We only listen. So the Granthi is also treating us like the teachers in the olden days, where they thought we were empty vessels, and all they've got to do is just fill us with knowledge, you see. And there's no kind of like responsiveness. And so that's why without that discourse, we can come away. We learn something through osmosis. We learn something by absorbing, the words and the sounds of the words, the energy, I suppose. But we're not kind of experimenting. We're not challenging ourselves to make that knowledge come alive as we are when we're having a discourse.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is all the good as like that. When people say they're money making machines, well, you need the money to make them work. You can't have a building with costs which you can't fill, pay the bills. So there is an element to that. But when there is surplus wealth, surplus money, shall we say, Maya, in that system, it should be put back into serving the masses, serving the Sangat, and creating those forums. It's a difficult one to speak. I mean, I'm a Prabandhak, I'm an assistant secretary in a Gurdwara here in Derby, and also, work with the Supreme Sikh Council UK over the last 10, 12 years. And there's no answer for it. There is got to be a debate, and I keep putting this out there. What does Sikhi need to look like in 2050? So this 30-year or 28-year now horizon, what does Sikhi in the UK look like in 2050? And I think most of us got our heads stuck in the sand. We don't want to face that. Let's just deal with it here and now. And very much like Maharaja Ranjit Singh's time, 39-year rule, 40-year rule ended in a calamity. I have this fear that Sikhi in the UK may go similar route. It might end up being a very, there is a Sikh in the town. Yeah, a bit like the Star Wars, there is a Ben Kenobi that lives out on the hill somewhere. We might end up like that. There is, okay, I know we only need one amongst 120,000, but that was for a different motive, different reason. There's a risk that our faith gets diluted down to, well, if you've not been to Gurdwara, you haven't had that osmosis, well, where have you discoursed it and discussed and learnt the real essence of Sikhi? Because you can read a Guru Granth Sahib, you can learn it, you can parrot fashion it, which is great, it's the first step, but then to debate it internally, debate it externally, and learn, the origins of the Sakhis, the origins of the Gurbani and the Sakhis behind them, more about the Guru's lives themselves. I don't know, we're getting further away from that, and the ability to discourse. I think the Gurdwara is a starting place, but I don't think you need the Gurdwaras totally to do that. When people want to acquire knowledge, they do it. You always sat here through a LinkedIn link, wasn't it, that I replied to, which you got us connected a year or so ago. And maybe that is the world. Maybe cyberspace is the future, where we connect people, and it's not connect people for the sake of it, because you can get connected to thousands of people across the planet, but you need to connect in such a way you can actually create something. You can have an action plan that you can then deliver. So out of this, you're having a conference. Hopefully the conference leads to action, even if it's one action amongst 50 people. Someone takes an action away to, you know what, got something from that. I'm going to go away and do this. And that's the essence. It's actions, you know, speak louder than words.
Well, the thing is, see, that these past 2 years during the pandemic, the majority of gurdwaras have been empty, you know, and the bigger ones, perhaps, you know, they used cyberspace to still continue those connections with the Sangat. But the pandemic has showed us that we don't need the physical buildings. You know, there are times when those physical buildings were forced to be closed, you know, total lockdown, we still survived, and we still were able to relate with the Sangat in cyberspace. And so I live in Birmingham, as you know, and there's at least 20 gurdwaras here. Most of, you know, I go to one or two of them, and they're not full. You know, there's not very many people unless there's a function, whatever. And so why do we need so many different buildings? And cyberspace will demonstrate to us we don't need to be investing in the buildings. We need to be investing in the energy rather than the matter.
That's a very radical thinking. Personally, I believe the more gurdwara there are, the better. And it's a contrarian thinking, because a gurdwara is a sangat. And if you have a very large gurdwara, you feel like a small cog in a big wheel. You feel lost. Whereas if a gurdwara is a small gurdwara, say a congregation 500, 600, 1,000, you pretty much know each other. That is a proper sangat. That's a community. That's where you are looking out for each other. You know, your pain is my pain. My happiness is your happiness. You can actually feel and live that. Whereas if you're now turning Sikhi into, oh yeah, just we've got a program, or better go. That's just a ritual. It's become ritualistic like that.
Yeah, and I understand, because in cyberspace, the you know, the Guru Granth Sahib is not there in cyberspace. You know, it's like, yes, I'm just kind of like putting thoughts out there. You know,
No. So taking my thinking further, a gurdwara in cyberspace is not a bad idea. Gurdwara Dharamsala is a community, a sangat of people who center around the Guru Granth Sahib. So if you have sangats online, I got no problem with that, because it's, you know, the Shabad is the Guru. Yeah, you know, we read it in Japji Sahib, you know, the Guru, the physical body of the Guru is great if you can do darshan of the physical body of the Guru. If you can go to where the Guru Granth Sahib resides, even greater, because now you've seen the Guru and you've seen the Guru in his abode. But greater still is a Sikh who dwells on the word of the Guru, and that word doesn't need, like you said, doesn't need to be in the Gurdwara, doesn't need to be in reading the Guru Granth Sahib verbatim. Once it's in your mind, once it's in your head, you can take it away. You can be anywhere, and the Guru's with you. So sat here just to share this with you, just like digressing, at the beginning of the pandemic, because kind of the keys were thrust in a couple of our as youngsters' hands, because the older generation were told to stay at home, we started to keep the Guru Gurdwara functioning in terms of, you know, cleanliness, heating, lighting, Guru Granth Sahib Seva. We actually resorted to Sunday Sangat online, and I know many Gurdwaras had the Gyan Granthi going in and just live streaming the function. We said no. I thought, hang on, it's an opportunity for Sangat to get involved. So we used to get the Sangat members to do something. So somebody would do some Spart, somebody some Simran. We'd get young kids to do Kirtan online for an hour and a half. We'd have that Sangat on a Sunday morning, and it kept people connected. So I don't know if that was the right model or not, but people appreciated it. And obviously when the Gurdwaras opened up again, we didn't do live streaming, but people came 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever the rules were at the time. And they needed that individual spirituality. I think now we're back open. That Sangat, the communities are getting back together again. But you're right, there is a slightly slippery slope that you only go because you're invited, and otherwise you don't go. So yeah, if you're going to set up Sangat communities in cyberspace, go for it.
No, I was thinking more about discussions and debates rather than, you know.
Yes, yeah, Sangat coming together and, you know, debate a Shabad or debate something. or a concept, a principle, or a meriada or something, debate it.
Debate it
Because
and
a rising
focus.
tide lifts all ships. You know, if you've got some knowledge and you share it, guess what? My knowledge base increases.
Yes, that's right. And that's the power of synthesis through connections, you know. So my life world, your life world, you know, you build those bridges. It's like, well, how do you, you know, this is my experience in education. What's your experience in engineering? And, you know, and we have very different worldviews, we have very different life experiences. And it's like through sharing them, that's where we, you know, ideally, like the life world of each one of us expands because we have shared and we can see things from another
from a different perspective. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's keep connecting. Let's keep sharing that Sikhi between people. And it's when you're sitting in a debate where you're talking about Sikhi, you don't want to stop that debate.
Yeah, that's right. I
and
could
when
carry
you're
on
talking,
talking to you.
You want to carry on talking, but you've got to be disciplined. So we've just set up recently a Wednesday evening Simon club class, call it what you like. And I've said to people, I said, look, bring your cohorts together, bring a bunch of people together, they're regular, so they develop and grow together. It shouldn't be a free for all drop in. Anybody's welcome, but have a cohort, grow your cohort so feels like a family type environment where you're learning and you'll feel like you're in a safe space where you can have difficult discussions. It's not but centered around Sikhi, and no one person has the answer. We've all got different pieces of the puzzle, and if we can come together in that Sangat and put those pieces together, you synthesize the real truth, the truth for you going forward and passing on to the next generation.
Okay, excellent.
That's a way forward then, maybe.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Ranjit Singh ji. I've really enjoyed my conversation with you. I found it really stimulating and lots of thoughts which we will explore as time comes.
No, my pleasure. Absolutely. Thank you, Benji, for having me. What's the next steps? Is there a date in April or something? Is it
on the 16th? Did I ask you that already? I think
you did. Yeah, the 16th. And I think
you said you were busy.
In the morning I am. I think you is it a whole day thing?
Yes, I've got if you can make it for the 16th, are you available at 7 o'clock at all on that day?
I think the evening we said was okay. Let me have a quick look.
Yeah, because that'd be great.
Friday 16. Okay, so 16th. So Saturday, isn't it? 16th of April. At 7 p.m. Okay, I will try and do my best to keep that clear. You picked the Baisakhi weekend. So we've got obviously that day we've got 16th. We've got the Nishan Sahib Seva in the morning. And then with preparations for Sunday in Nagar Kirtan. So we're going to be Nagar Kirtan on this Sunday, after 2 years not being there. So that's all planned for Derby anyway. So I will do my best. I'll put in a diary, make sure nothing gets in the way, but be mindful just in case. Those lastminute.com things. Okay.
All right then.
You take care then. Okay.
Okay then. I'll see you on the 16th hopefully.
Sat Sri Akal.
Yes, Sat Sri Akal. Thank you. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji.